when you are using CSS code to change the appearance of a web page, first of all, you have to select an HTML element to change its appearance. Now, to select an element on a web page, you have three types of selectors. The first one is the element selector, next the ID selector, and the third one is the class selector. Now the element selector, it selects any HTML element based on the element name. Now suppose, assume this code. This code will select all the paragraphs on your web page. Suppose you have 2 or 3 or 10, 12 paragraphs on your web page. Now if you use the P as the selector, that means it is the element name, that means it is the paragraph. So this code will change the text color of every paragraph on your web page to red. Now if you want to give unique look to different paragraphs, so in that case you can't use the element selector because it will change the appearance of all the paragraphs. For this purpose, to give unique look to same elements, suppose there are 2 paragraphs in a web page but you want to give different looks to 2 different paragraphs. For this, either you can use the ID selector or you can use the element class selector. Now for the ID selector, each HTML element has an ID attribute and you can select an HTML element based on the value of that ID attribute. Now ID is a unique attribute. The value of the ID attribute must be unique for each and every HTML element. So the advantage of using ID selector is that using ID selector you can use the CSS code to change the appearance of a particular HTML element. Suppose there are 2 paragraphs in your web page and you provide the ID main to one paragraph and then you provide the ID sub to another paragraph. So now using this main attribute value, you can change the appearance of that paragraph only. So whenever you use the ID selector to write the CSS code, you have to provide the hash character first, followed by the ID of that element, like this. Suppose there is a paragraph with ID main, so to write CSS code you have to write hash main, then whatever CSS code you want to write for that paragraph. So the advantage of this, you can change the look of different elements uniquely because ID is the unique for every HTML element. Now like ID selector, there is also class selector and every element of HTML element has a class attribute. But unlike ID, the class attribute is not unique. That means if your web page has one h1 element and another say paragraph element, so you can use the same class name for both of these elements. You can use the same class name for each one. You can say use that same class name to your paragraph, or you want to use the same class name to your bulleted list or numbered list. You can do that. It is not unique in nature. So whenever you want to use the value of class attribute to change the look of an HTML element, you have to write the period or dot character first, followed by the class name of that element. So suppose this code, suppose in your web page there is one h1 and another paragraph, then you write dot heading. So this heading is the class name you already provided to your h1 element and p element. So whenever you write dot heading and the color goes to red, then the color of both your heading h1 and your paragraph element will be red. So same class name you can apply to different HTML element. But you can also use this class selector to select a specific element like the ID selector. How? I already told that if you have a h1 element and p element in your web page and both having the class name heading, so whenever you write dot heading and your code goes to color red, that means both the color of the h1 and the paragraph will be changed to red. Now if you want to specifically change the color of the paragraph only having the heading class, then you have to write like this, that is p dot heading. It will only change the color of the paragraph which have the class name heading. It will not change the color of other paragraphs, or even it will not change the color of the h1 element which also has the class name heading. So like this, using the element name and the class selector as a combo, you can also change the look of a specific element. One another advantage of class selector is that a single HTML element can have multiple class names. Suppose you want to change the look of your h1 in different way, and you can provide two class names like this. You can increase the size of your heading using this big class, and you can change the position of your h1 using this position class. So a single element, with a single element you can use multiple class names. But with ID selector that is not possible. So this is another advantage of class selector. Now the last proportion of the selector is the grouping. Whenever you want to provide the same look to different element of your web page, you can group them and use the same code like this. Suppose you want to change the color of both your headings and your paragraphs, so you can group them in one code. So you can write h1 comma p and then whatever CSS codes you want to write. Now this will minimize the coding part. So grouping selectors is advantageous in the case when you want to provide the same CSS code for different elements of your web page. Now you can not only group the HTML element names, like you not only use the element name for grouping, you can also use class names to group the selectors. You can also in case of when you want to grouping the selectors, you can also use the class selector, you can also use the group selectors. You can do that in different ways. You can group selectors to use the same code to different elements. So these are the selectors using which you can select an element on the web page and change its look.